You just can't prosecute them. You can't say whether or not you would bring charges. And then they find in this memo that the president, according to what they surmise from the report, should not be charged with obstruction. However, they've left a clue here just to cover themselves. Just a reminder, Attorney General Bill Barr, you helped us come to this opinion that we are now giving you, and which you are now saying is what you relied on. So in other words, Bill Barr relied on the work product that was heavily influenced by his own opinion to formulate his ultimate opinion. This is like the functional equivalent of Dick Cheney leaking to a former New York Times reporter that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. That New York Times reporter writing it in the New York Times, and then Dick Cheney going on Meet the Press and saying, I'm just quoting the New York Times, which says that there's evidence of weapons of mass destruction.
And the incentive that you referenced at the beginning for the Biden DOJ is to protect this kind of now proven to be, I guess, not false, but shaky firewall between the OLC and the DOJ. So, like, this is a lesson in that no matter how extreme the Trump administration was, the Biden administration is going to cover up, essentially, their exploitation of the institution's lack of I guess morality is not the right word, but
just ethics.
Ethics, right?
And yes, I mean, this is an ongoing theme, right? When dealing with the Republicans, and that is they are abusing the system. And the question is, how do you fight that? Do you fight that by maintaining the integrity and the depoliticization of the Justice Department, or even the perception?
That's the perception, because they know. Yes. Go on.
That's the point, is that they know it's just a perception, because it would not be a politicization of the DOJ to say, okay, we can release this memo because Jackson, the judge, wants to release it publicly because it shows there has been nefarious malfeasance by the former attorney general. The judge's opinion concluded that rather than Barr following the OLC advice, his decision and the OLC memo were being written by the very same people at the very same time. In other words, he was involved in writing the advice that he supposedly followed. Let me read one more. Not only was the attorney general being disingenuous then, but the DOJ has been disingenuous to this court with respect to the existence of a decision-making process that should be shielded by the deliberative process privilege. In other words, that the DOJ, even in trying to maintain the lack of release of this memo, is being disingenuous, because the deliberative process was in itself disingenuous, and therefore does not deserve the protection that the OLC and the Justice Department claims it does. The judge also found claims made by the department to try and shield the memo from public scrutiny are so inconsistent with the evidence in the record, they are not worthy of credence, and said the department sought to obfuscate that it had set out to create a legal justification for a decision department leaders had already made, which is to not accuse the president of a crime. In other words, they had what they wanted to find, and then they basically said, we're going to create a process that will lead us to that decision we've already made?
I mean, the Biden administration's, attitude here is very reminiscent of when Obama came into office, came on the campaign, hot off the campaign trail, critiquing the Bush administration's massive amounts of abuses, and did very little to roll back in any structural way the lack of oversight and laws that allowed for those abuses to happen, because Democrats' attitude is we want the option to be able to use these kinds of fluid parameters or the fluidity of them to our advantage if we want to do so. And they often will do so. It's not going to be so nakedly corrupt as, say, the Trump administration or the Bush administration, but they have an incentive to maintain the fiction in themselves because, say, Biden needs to use the OLC at some point for some purpose. You don't want to kind of expose that, oh, wow, there isn't this, siloed process that we're pretending that there is. So there is, one hand washes the other a little bit here in maintaining a fiction.
That's possible. And it's also just sort of the failure to understand that upholding some principles about the and protect the institution doesn't work if it only is applied one half of the time. I mean, we see this with the institutionalists in the Senate, the hesitation supposedly. And I think there have been in the past, I think, a significant percentage of the senators who are just institutionalists. I mean, I'm not defending that position, but I think it was a genuine perspective. And it took far too long for them to understand that, look, the institution's being abused and you are holding up some type of vision that doesn't exist. And you are not going to salvage the institution by applying applying these principles in overly timid ways. Yes, there is a danger that people will see a Department of Justice that releases the memo from the OLC from the prior administration as being politicized. But to a certain extent, if what they were doing was nefarious, you got to do it. But I also think that you're right. They're protecting the privilege for themselves in the future because you never know what they're going to want not to be released, with the next set of, but if they think that the next Donald Trump would not release memos in this instance, I mean, they did, right? I mean, they did. They released who uncovered, who had access to the FISA reports. I mean, they've done this and they're going to do it anyways. But
I know. And it's amazing to me how Democrats like Biden, who fetishize institutions, especially the Senate in Biden's case, right? When those institutions are rolled back or significantly injured by Republican exploitation, there's incredible reluctance to restore, which is bizarre to me, if that's kind of one of your guiding principles.
Yep. All right, let's move on to, and we'll circle back around to the filibuster and the infrastructure in just a moment. But this is an interesting story. There was a fight for board members who sit atop the ExxonMobil board. And this is the first time, it's my understanding, that something like this has happened. The Exxon board, essentially, or, C-suite, they nominate a bunch of people to sit on the board, a bunch, 10, 12. And they do so because they want to make sure that the board members are on board, literally and figuratively, with the broad agenda of the company, which is to pull as much and extract as much fossil fuel from the ground as they can before, government regulation sets in, or whatever parameters it is. And this has been ongoing, I guess, for a while. A hedge fund named Engine Number One, which was set up, and they would argue that it's really just that it isn't about ideology. This is according to Chris James, is quoted in the New York Times. It's about economics. Founder of Engine Number One said in an interview, "In economics is what has driven the adoption of some of the alternative fuel sources versus fossil fuels. We want there to be an acceptance of change." So Engine Number One teamed up with a bunch of big pension funds, including the New York State Common Retirement Fund and the California Public Employees Retirement System. And Engine Number One, which owns less than 1% of Exxon stock, began its campaign, I guess, about 4 or 5 months ago. And they got 2 of their candidates voted on to the board. And these candidates are people who believe that that ExxonMobil should turn their attention to alternative sources of energy. Exxon tried to head off the dissident investors, which apparently have included some descendants of John D. Rockefeller, who founded Standard Oil, which ultimately became Exxon. And there are 2, I guess, board seats that are still extant that they still may win. I'm not sure what the election process is, but Exxon last week was trying to convince shareholders not to vote for these dissident board nominees. They said it would add 2 new directors to the board later this year, including a climate expert. One can only imagine what where that climate expert would come from.
The climate expert is just like a longtime Exxon executive, except with Groucho glasses on. So, you know.
Yeah. But this hedge fund, Engine Number One, I don't know much about it other than it was started in, fairly recently, last year, presumably maybe to do this type of thing. And this is a big deal. It's a big deal because once you basically prevent these companies from pursuing certain business practices, we've talked about this in the past. This is, we need legislation. We need administrative help from the president, but we also sabotaging these companies or undercutting their agenda to extract all this oil. Also part of the repertoire. We should say, speaking of things going in the wrong direction, during the Trump administration, the Trump White House signed off on an oil and gas project on the North Slope of Alaska, which will supposedly produce more than 100,000 barrels of oil a day for the next 30 years. You'll recall that Biden is talking about pivoting this country away from fossil fuels, having emissions by 2030.
But pivoting in like a slow motion kind of Michael Jackson kind of way, right? Like
apparently that pivot is really slow. I mean, it's almost like it's almost as if he's just sort of like put on a pair of, I don't know, rollerblades and just letting the earth spin as a way of him pivoting.
It's a beautiful image.
Thank you. The project known as Willow is a multi-million-dollar plan from ConocoPhillips to drill in part of the National Petroleum Reserve. And the Biden administration could either have declined to defend the oil drilling or support a federal decision backed by the state of Alaska, which apparently some tribal nations as well. This is from the New York Times. Union and key officials, including Lisa Murkowski, who is a moderate Republican senator, somehow the Biden administration thinks will be some type of ally somewhere. I don't know in what context that could possibly happen. but they have decided that the Interior